Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Adam Argyle joins me, and we're going to discuss the new responsive design, not just for mobile and for phones and stuff like that, but other considerations when it comes to responsive design there. And Adam definitely knows the stuff when it comes to this, definitely more than I do. So he will definitely break this down well. But before we kind of get to that, Adam, if you were riding in an Uber and he turned around and asked you, "So what do you do?" How would you respond to that?
Yes, it's almost like telling my grandma. What do I tell my grandma? I'm a teacher. I'm hired by Chrome to teach how to build stuff for Chrome, and then simultaneously I listen to other people who build stuff for Chrome, and then I help Chrome get better. It's almost like if a hammer had an advocate, and it went around, this guy went around hammering stuff with it, like, hey, I hit that nail, I hit this other nail, and then he's like realized, well, if we shape the handle just a little bit different, I was listening to some of the other construction dudes that we could hammer even better, and then I take that back to Chrome. We make a better hammer, and then I show up the next day and I'm like, hey, hammer V2. And yeah, mostly in a teaching role, but yeah, I also help change the browser, help change the specs, and mostly building front end stuff. I build UI, so the part that you touch with your fingers, the part that your little mouse arrow clicks. Yeah, I work on that part.
And if he then responded, "How'd you get into that?" How would you respond to that?
Ooh, nice. Let's see. Junior high, I was into Photoshop. I was into making GIFs back then too, just like by hand, frame by frame. I just paint them just for funsies. And later I got into computer science. And as I was going through all these Java classes, there's all these people that were so happy to write their Java apps, and the math worked. And they were like, yes, it did the math. And I was like, well, let's make it look cool. And they were like, no. And I was like, well, I want to make it look good. And so I learned Flash. And once I learned Flash, I was like, oh, it's on now. I know where I'm supposed to be. I'm not just that brain. I have this side that needs to be fulfilled. And so I went to art school. I switched out of computer science and went to art school and studied design. And while I was at design, I was at an agency building apps. And so I've kind of always been getting inundated with like building things in computer science, and then design and color and spacing and typography. And that has shaped me into who I am today.
No, that's awesome, man. If you haven't seen any video of Adam, he's also got some pretty sick tattoos, so you can definitely see some of that artistic and design side come out with his kind of self-expression as well. So that's really cool. So I think kind of with that set up, the Uber driver now knows what you do and kind of how you got to where you are today. So kind of with that, today I was hoping to talk about the new responsive design. As you've given talks, I think the talk that I particularly saw was at like a Figma conference. I forget the exact name of it, but I think it was on their YouTube channel. So I definitely recommend people going and checking that out. It was a very good presentation and very well done. But you kind of introduced to me anyways, the concept of the new responsive design. And I would say I'm definitely guilty in the past of just thinking about responsive design as making something look good on mobile. But you guys kind of talk about there's definitely other considerations here. So what kind of is this new responsive design? And then we'll kind of get into how a developer can actually implement some of these things.
Awesome. Yeah. So it's like the traditional responsive design flow is like squeeze your browser down until the layout sucks, and then make a breakpoint. And then squeeze the layout down some more until it sucks, and then make a breakpoint, and it's like the breakpoints just so happen to line up at like a phone size or a tablet size. You're like, well, that's just nice. I feel pretty good about that. But like what we're realizing is that viewport request, where you're like, what's the size of the viewport? Let me adjust this little widget over here on the side. That was kind of a hack. It was really just the best that we had. But what we really want is we want this component to like know how much space it's in. Because you could be on like a ginormous desktop or on a mobile device, and maybe the component looks the same because, well, it's not a big component. It's just one to be, it's like a little card or something. It doesn't really grow that much in a desktop scenario, but it's more important. Is the card in the sidebar? Is the card the first card? Is the card the last card? There's all these like additional factors that play into it. Plus, and then this is in the talk a lot, is we've got user preferences that come into this. So do they want light or dark theme? What's their preferred font size? Do they want motion? What's their contrast requests? Are they on low data? The those sort of questions. And then you also have the device. Like the device that they have has capabilities, and you can respond to those, air quotes respond. And so we're far beyond the concept of the viewport being our target for being adaptive. We want new powers. And so those powers landed. They got heavily requested for like 10 years too. Everyone's like, we want container queries. I'm thinking of that South Park episode right now where we want privacy. We want privacy. We want container queries. And they're here. They're in every browser. And they enable this component model where, like, instead of the page telling a component what to do, like a parent telling a child, like, hey, you, get over there. The child can now just be like, well, how much space do I have? When I'm in this amount of space, I can look this way. When I have this many children, I will look this way. And so these components are owning so much more about what they need to look like in given certain scenarios. And so that's kind of the backbone of that whole talk.
And I think that I come from a React development background, so I kind of tend to think in components rather than thinking in like the viewport. So there's been countless times to where I've styled something relative to the viewport, but depending on where I use that component within my page, it looks quite different, and it can often look gross because you don't consider all the places you might use it. So I think, as you mentioned, considering the container something's in rather than just the entire viewport can definitely allow you to dial those styles in and make your components, especially in React, more reusable. And I know this isn't just React, like a lot of different frameworks use this kind of component model to reuse different components across their UI and stuff. So I think that's a super powerful way of going about styling things.
Yeah, it's meeting us where we are, right? Because pretty much everyone is building components now. Even if you're like just in vanilla HTML and CSS, you're probably making a class name called authors, and it's basically a little component. And it's just nice to think about that thing being portable. You imagine it's portable. We sell it to everyone like it's portable. Oh, these components can go anywhere in your application. And now they truly can, without a bunch of exceptions where that component just gets to own more of its responsibility. Yeah, it is truly more portable that way, which is nice.
Absolutely. And I know in your talk, you kind of split the new responsive design down into designing for the device, the user, and the interface. So we kind of skipped ahead to container queries a little bit there, as that is definitely one of the coolest features of that I'm definitely excited about. And I think you also mentioned in a different podcast that the adoption rate for some of these new features is actually somewhat low, but we can kind of maybe cover that if we have time at the end. But maybe if we start with, you guys first talked about kind of responsive design for the device, and you talked about a couple different things in there that were super interesting to me, which were dynamic viewport units, as well as kind of HDR color gradients. So could you maybe touch on designing for the user's device and some different things that you can do there?
Awesome. Yes, I super can. The dynamic viewport units is like a funny one. I'm a little upset at them because they kind of made things complicated. So you have to imagine that we've been using viewport units for a while, not the dynamic ones. We had 100 VH, for example. It's like in our minds, we think of the viewport and we think about it on our computer, and like the viewport is what's in the browser tab, right? It's like that square. We're on mobile. When we launch the app, we imagine it's the full space that app has been launched into. But we're in the browser. There's stuff in the way. And when it thinks of 100 VH, it's not including that stuff, like the title bar, the address bar, or maybe if you're on iOS or Android with a couple flags flipped or whatever, you got the title bar at the bottom. These things are overlaying your viewport. And so when you ask for 100 VH, you're actually getting more than just the part that is in between there. So to fix this, they didn't fix the viewport units. They gave you a whole bunch of new options. And so now we have small viewport units, large viewport units, and dynamic. So the small would be the smaller of that space, it's basically subtracting the status bar and the address bar. And it's permanent that way too. So like you can rely on the small viewport unit to always be that small one. So even if you scroll the page a little bit and those things disappear, 100 SVH is still the smaller of that size. Large is the opposite, where it always takes the large version. And dynamic is like, well, if the status bar is in, I'm small. If the status bar is gone, I'm large. And so now we can like really manipulate that and be considerate of the presence of these elements pretty much exclusively on mobile, with these new dynamic viewport units. They brought a whole bunch of new units too. It's like 22 new units or something like that. It's out of control.
And I would definitely recommend just going and look it up, dynamic viewport units, if you want to see like the list of them and stuff like that. I don't think it would be crazy valuable for us to just like list every single one, nor I definitely couldn't. Maybe you can, but I'm not sure.
I've got a blog post that has all the units that we have on the web right now. I think there's 54. So just, yeah, go to my blog. It's nerdy.dev. Do a quick little search for units or whatever, and you'll find the post, and it'll let you switch between all the units and learn what they are, see what your current browser support is. I think the only one that the browsers don't support right now is the cap unit, which represents like the cap height. Then we've got, so yeah, do you want to talk about color now? I don't know. Let me know when you want to transition.
I would love to talk about color. What do you kind of recommend with color? As I know in your talk that you gave at that Figma comp, there was some really interesting examples of gradients, and gradients looking kind of better or worse depending on whether you use these HDR kind of color gradients versus others. So what is kind of the state of color at CSS, and what do you kind of recommend?
Awesome. Cool. You sound like you've really ramped up on this stuff. Good, which is very nice. The state of colors is most of us have a really nice screen in our pockets. A lot of us have a TV that's got a really nice screen, and they're capable of showing millions and billions of colors. And it's always just been this kind of joke until I went and was like researching it, because we have RGB and we've been using it for 25 years, probably longer. And no one's ever been like, that red isn't red enough. You know, maybe sometimes you'll hear someone say they magically made a brighter white. And you're like, there's a brighter white? What does that even mean? And then we have these new TVs, or even like the new Switch, the OLED Switch has blacker blacks. So you're like, ooh, you want to play Diablo on this Switch, which has like kind of gray stuff going on, or do you want to play Diablo on the one that goes like dark? And you're like, I want the dark one. And so these are high dynamic ranges. A lot of them is like, how bright can the lights go and how dark can the lights go? And so when we're talking about color, CSS is kind of ahead of the curve right now. It's been like a chicken and egg problem. We needed people to have the devices, which still they're not everywhere. I mean, I've got this monitor right here that we're on. It's not an HDR monitor. I don't think any of my, no, one of my TVs is. Anyway, so we needed screens to be caught up, and images and video were the first thing to get it. So like you go to YouTube and you go to these spots, they're HDR capable. And that's been really important for movies. Like you always heard about like, what's his face, Cameron shooting a movie with some crazy red camera, right? You're like, oh, the red, what does that do? Lots of colors and quality. You're like, oh, that's great. So we've been capturing in that, then we needed to deliver it. So we first shipped images and video, and now we're at the point where CSS is like, we've defined how to do this with code, and we're kind of one of the first major platforms to really deliver it. I think iOS had P3 early. Even the iOS browser had display P3 really early, and that was, in my opinion, because they wanted their store to look amazing. You open up an iPad and you go to the App Store, it looks gorgeous. You don't really know why, other than the design's good. But a lot of those colors are HDR colors, and so they do look more vibrant. You hold an iPad next to another screen, and you're like, I want the iPad. So these things sound dinky, like, oh, is it red or red, white or white? But at the end of the day, if someone's got a choice between two in front of their face, they're going to pick one over the other almost always. So it's like a product excellence thing. And so CSS is caught up. We've got the ability to specify colors in HDR. So you can say display P3. You can even max out the red and just be like, give me the maximum red that this high dynamic range screen can do. And then it goes all the way into gradients. So gradients, you can specify the colors in P3. So you have like, you know, super red to super blue. But then you can also specify how they interpolate. So when it travels from that color to the other one, if it does it in HSL or these other different color spaces, each color space has a shape. You could think of about it like a mountain. One has mountains, one has valleys, one has rivers. And each color space has this like different environment that the color has to go through. And there's a color space called OK Lab that is specifically made to stay super vibrant and true to your color tones as you make the journey from one color to a next. And now you can specify that in CSS. So we've got, yeah, this is like the HD gradients concept. Not only are the colors in the gradient more vibrant, they're in a more vibrant color space to do the work.
Yeah, that's definitely awesome. And I know that in your talk, you show some really cool examples of using gradients across, like, I think you showed like a Figma title and using gradient colors across their title. And with like the HDR gradient, you can see like full like vibrant colors throughout the entire title. But with non-HDR, you see like the middle letters are just kind of grayed out and they're just kind of missing color. And it became really obvious in that example that this HDR kind of color gradient definitely allows you to have like a more full depth of gradients and colors and different things like that. So I think this is definitely something that, like you said, it's hard to know until you see them side by side. It's hard to put a finger on what it is, but it definitely, one just looks better than the other. And it's hard to like, if someone that doesn't know anything about HDR gradients and definitely doesn't know as much as you might just be like, well, this one looks better, but I have no idea why. Well, that might be why. The color space is just that much better for that.
Yeah, it's like those little secret hints, you know, like it happens in typography. We've got like letter spacing and kerning and line height and these things that are just like, that's just a number. It's not that big a deal. And then someone uses the number in a really cool way and you're like, well, that number does matter. And then you also see people screw that number up and you're like, the line height's broken. I can't even read this lump of text. Yeah, color's dangerous. It's a totally humongous topic that's almost more intense than computer science. That's why like a lot of like super nerds love the math, because the math actually produces something they can see. So they're building 3D spaces. They've got all these crazy, like a Photoshop, a lot of the actions that you could do in there would give you every pixel. And so they'd iterate over every pixel and be like, what color is it? You know, like how can I manipulate this color? Almost like shaders. I did build a tool too. So also real quick, I got lucky at the config conference that they had such nice screens, because if they had a projector, it wouldn't be a high vibrancy projector and I'd be showing these slides and people would be like, they look the same. And I'd be like, you gotta trust me. But it's really nice that they had a nice screen and they you could see the difference. But yeah, go to gradient.style on one of your devices that has a high quality or an HDR screen, and you can there's a little button to flip between SDR and HDR, and you'll get a feel for it. And you'll be like, okay, I get it. These colors are nice. And then that tool will help you pick colors and choose the interpolation space and preview it and change your gradient. And that's a nice new modern gradient space. Yeah.
Yeah, and that tool is definitely awesome. I know that you demoed that, and like you said, you're lucky that they had like those capable monitors and stuff, or else that would have been like, trust me, guys.
Flop. Yeah.
Yeah. As some demos go, but your guys' demo did not go that route. It went very well.
Yeah, I was so happy when we showed up. I was like, screens, real screens.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that covers some different things that someone can consider when designing for the device. And you guys also kind of next up covered designing for the user. And this is where you kind of talk through different things like REM units, or using different themes, or using prefers reduced motion for animations and different things like that. So could you maybe hit on what it kind of means to design for the user, and then what a developer might consider, what they could maybe use to design better applications for like the user in mind?
Absolutely. Like there's two really good examples that I like to start with, which is, one is look at your grandma's phone or look at your parents' phone. And usually they open up the messaging app and they've got the text zoomed up all the way to the maximum. You're like, oh, I guess you're old. Okay. So you need to see larger text. And we can use that preference in our web designs, right? And they're going to be so happy when they load the page and be like, oh, good, I'm not going to squint when reading it. And to opt into that, you need to use a non-absolute unit for your font sizes, and that's where REM comes in. So one REM is going to equal their preferred font size. And so you can build upon that. You can make your headers a REM unit. So, like 3 REM or 4 REM is going to make it a nice bigger title size. And all the way down to like, you can do a 0.8 or 0.9 REM if you do want to deliver some slightly smaller text. You know that they'll still probably be able to read it because the base size that they want is 1 REM. And yeah, it's really common though for people to go into their app and the first thing to do is they go HTML, font size 16 pixels. And your grandma and your parents are going to open up the app you built and go, great, another app I can't read. It's just like, don't. And the other fun example is like Kindles and e-readers. This is bringing the user's preferences into that experience, has been there since the beginning. Like you open it up, it's like, do you want font sans serif or serif? And you're like, sans serif, duh, maybe I do. I don't know. I'm going to try them both on, and then like you change the font size. It's even got like contrast sliders, or it's like, what tint do you want? Do you want a cool night tint or do you want a warm sepia tint? You're like, I don't know. And those are really fun moments for the user to feel like I'm part of this experience. They must want me to read this. is how they're feeling as a user. And that is what we want them to do. So the browser gives the user an option for font size. They can go into the settings. There's font sizes in the operating system. The operating system lets you pick a theme, light or dark. You can, of course, use that in your design as well. And then there's also things like the contrast preference and their reduced motion preference. So some people there's many people that reduce motion for multiple reasons. One of them is schools reduce motion for the tablets and books that they give out because they're distracting to students. So they're like, we'll just make it not do that. I've seen a lot of people take off the animations on their iPhone because their phone feels faster. They hit that home button, they're right there at the home screen. There's none of that super zoomy experience. And then there's also, of course, people that got the iPhone 7 or whatever and threw up. And we're like, well, I don't want people to throw up using my app. That sounds bad for business. And so you can bring the user into these things and through CSS, ask the device, hey, device, what's this user's preference for this thing? And it says, this is their preference. You're like, cool, then I will give them these styles to go along with that. And so, yeah, so now we're looking at their device, what it can do. We're looking at the user and what they like and what they need. These things are becoming part of our design and our end result. And yeah, it's pretty cool. It's also complicated. I like to think of these things as layers as well. You don't have to have every layer when you first drop your app. You can add a dark mode later. We see that all the time. You can add reduced motion later. These things can just be added on, but it's nice to know that they're there for you.
And I would say it's also nice to know this stuff going into writing new parts of your code base and stuff like that, because if you can use rem units from the start and relative units rather than just putting pixels on everything, it can be easier kind of in the long run rather than having to come back and change everything. So I think that this kind of provides a good outline of covering some of the user preferences, relative units, preferences around animations and different things like that, as well as for the device. But you guys also cover preferences for the interface. And this is where you guys kind of talked about container queries, which we kind of talked about a little bit at the outset here. But you also talk about style queries, content awareness, text wrap, variable fonts, all this stuff. So could you maybe cover a couple of these when it comes to designing for the interface and what considerations that someone should have here?
Yeah, so the task isn't done, right? We're talking about we all work in a component model. We'd like to stay in that component to build out all its capabilities and all its presentation tier elements that need to show up, whether it's in the sidebar in the main area, whether it's the hero card or if it's just a sub card. And CSS has so many different features to support our ability to work like that now. And as you were mentioning, we've got container queries, which can look to see the width of its parent element, and it can actually call and ask any parent element. It doesn't have to be the first one, the first container it finds. You can say specifically, I want to know how big this main content area is, and it can adjust itself. And those width queries, so there's no height queries yet, just inline size. And that's because there was a lot of recursion they were worried about happening. If you knew how big the width was, then you'd make yourself bigger than that. And all of a sudden, the query that just was true is now false, and you can get an infinite loop, just like you can with hover, by the way, right? I'm sure we've all done that. You hover on something, and then it just jiggles back and forth forever. And you're like, oh yeah, I guess I shouldn't do that. And you usually make another wrapping element, and then one you're hovering and one you're actually moving, and so that way it stays stationary or whatever. But yeah, there's also things like the new has pseudo selector, :has, can look to see anything. It's insanely powerful. It can look to see if an element, like an input's state, is valid or invalid, and then change the whole form. If one element is invalid, it can just change the whole form. It can count how many children there are. And so yeah, we had demos where here's a nav bar. The nav bar, when it only has one link and one brand and a search icon, we're going to kind of spread them all out, right? Brand goes in the middle, search icon on the far right, blah, blah, blah. But as soon as we add more links, and I show in the demo us adding links to the thing, at about 4 links, it goes, oh, I'll just go become a traditional menu here now. I'll put the logo on the left, I'll put the search bar, in the middle now, and I'll put all the links on the right or whatever. And so it can look to see what it has to show and adapt. And that was a quantity query. Style queries are things that are kind of like classes, but style queries right now can ask a custom property what value it is. And I was just building a card like this the other day where I had a card and it's sitting on top of a background. It has a nice shadow. And that background of that card was conflicting with another element. So in a component model, I had a component that can live anywhere, and it has the same background color as the card. And as soon as it was on the card, it lost its concept of a background color because they were the same. So I could say, hey, query this parent, look at its private property called card background. If it's the same color as me, bump up my lightness, whatever, make me look in front of it. And so I can adapt to the actual results that are in the DOM. So yeah, getting to this concept of like responsive to the interface, meaning the moment after all these other things. So the device is coming into play, the width is coming into play, the color quality, their preferences. And now we're looking at an interface and like this component is sitting in the middle of it and it gets to be smart still. And yeah, there's so much here to talk about, but yeah, that's a pretty good overview. You had any other specific questions?
No, I think that was a really good overview. And I think that for a lot of these examples, they're kind of situations that you can almost use conditionals in CSS rather than having to write like specific JavaScript to where you get the element, and then if your container width or your window width is certain, then you show this list of items, or else you show this list, and you can kind of use CSS for some of these use cases, which is definitely going to be a lot easier in the long run to kind of maintain and extend and do different things like that. So I think that covers things regarding that very well. You guys also talked about kind of view transitions and stuff. I know that one was kind of cool. So do you want to touch on that maybe just a little bit?
Yeah, I'm obsessed with this API. Are you familiar with flip animations, the first, last, invert, play?
I'm not, no.
It was kind of a hack for what we had to do before. So like, let's say you click an element and it's got an image and you want to put it into a modal, for example, a classic Lightroom or a gallery scenario. If you wanted that image to grow from where it was into its new location, there was a lot of junk you had to do. You had to draw the modal with it in its final state, but hidden, can't be seen yet. Otherwise they'd just see it instantly. So you render it, and that's called the first, that's like the first, last, invert, play. So we go first state. So we take a snapshot of the element when it's small, and we go last. So we render it large, take a snapshot of the new position of the elements. Then we invert it back to being in its old state, like a closed state. And then we play, because now we know how big it's going to grow to. We can animate it and say, go from 200 pixels to 400 pixels and be this tall from the viewport, blah, blah, blah. And you get that morph effect. And it was the only way that we could do it was by hand measuring its before and after state and writing an animation for it as a pain in the butt. And so now what we have is this API in the browser called View Transitions, which can do all sorts of stuff, but essentially it does that. It takes a picture, it's literally a picture of the element before, and then you do a bunch of modifications to something like, let's say you put it in a modal, and then it has the after, and it will animate the element between there. It'll animate the actual images or video if they're playing, and keep the video live as it's animating into its new position. But this also lets you do things like animate display none. So like literally you whether it's CSS or JavaScript, if you're modifying the document, it's got a before state and an after state. Some things were hidden. But yeah, view transitions. I have a demo too that it's like a little mini editor. So you could imagine like local development. As you're making changes, you're changing the document, right? You're changing the styles, you're changing the components, internals, like what type of HTML elements it has. And this API, just all you have to do is say, hey, document, start view transition. And that tells the browser you're about to modify the DOM. So it takes that picture of the starting state. Then you go do whatever you want, like set a whole bunch of crap to display none. And then you say, and then your function ends, like your JavaScript function ends, and it's like, I'm done. And it takes a picture after it. It counts all the things that moved, makes images for all of them, sends them all to the compositor, like the graphics engine, and says, hey, render these as beautiful as you can. And they go, they fly into space. You can use CSS to describe how something leaves the stage, like if it got deleted. You can talk about, describe how something comes in the stage, how something morphs if it's still in the stage and goes between areas. It's awesome. Pretty much everything's animatable. The only things I've found that can't be animated are like text left to text right, like changing the alignment. But you can animate things in grid that you could never animate before, like the alignment and distribution properties. You can animate those. So I have a demo too where you just click on this canvas and it moves a little box around, and it's just setting a random justify items and a random align items. And it's animating these using the View Transitions API, which is, these are normally non-animatable, but here they are being animated thanks to View Transitions. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds like a replacement for a lot of hacky JavaScript that I've done in the past to try to get like some of these effects when doing these things. So that's really cool here. Unfortunately, I have a meeting here in just a couple of minutes, but if people want to kind of stay up to date with what you're doing, they want to check out more of your stuff, they're like, hey, this guy knows his shit. He knows what he's talking about. I need to make sure I followed him. Where should they go for that?
Twitter, I'm on there just posting tips and fun little videos every day. And then my site, nerdy.dev, that's like my own personal social network. And you can subscribe to the RSS there or just visit it whenever you want. And you'll be up to date with all the things happening in CSS.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Adam. I really enjoyed it.
Of course, dude. It's really fun being here. Thanks for inviting me.